Video games are just magic, aren't they? Somewhere between the initial announcement and the eventual release, a game just manages to be formed from the nothingness of the universe and suddenly plop down into the lap of John Video's game, who then delivers it upon the unsuspecting masses of the world. But more and more recently, games have been criticized for something called crunch, despite rarely having more than just a rich, nougaty center. When I first heard about the concept of crunch many years ago, I had no idea what it was, or what Captain Crunch had to do with video games, outside of Captain Crunch's Crunchling Adventure for PC, so I naturally did what anyone would do in that situation and started doing some research. But instead of finding myself inside of an oops all berries situation like I had hoped I'd find myself because oops all berries is delicious and not at all an accident, it's instead an oops all needless pain and unending misery berries situation, and now I'm sad. For those unaware, crunch in video games refers to the practice of overworking employees crafting the game for the sake of appealing capitalistic shareholders and the many fetid dregs of goblins and trolls that make up the consumer masses. Or at least that's how I would define it. But they aren't the only ones to blame for why there's video game crunch. They're just the ones who cry foul when a game is delayed or doesn't release the second it's announced because they want that sweet nougat-filled Oompa Loompa now! No, crunch in video game development as a practice is something that has been not so quietly escalating for years now. This is largely thanks to the greater technical demands that bigger and more expensive games require to build,
16 times the detail,
requiring larger teams of people to craft ever-expanding worlds, intricately detailed characters, physics systems that would make Sir Isaac Newton weep, and jiggle physics that confuse adolescent children and grown adults alike. To put it simply, games have just gotten a lot bigger as time has ticked by, without much really being done to, compensate for that. The more the game demands, the more time it demands to be made, and as such, crunch comes in when the proposed schedule doesn't line up with the actual development cycle. You see, game development is weird. You can fully plan out what gets made when in a video game based on past experiences or the technical know-how of the people making it, but unless you have a magical wizard staff that can somehow get everything done without any sort of problems whatsoever, one that could feed the poor, heal the sick, and restore the withered king seated upon the throne of Rohan, there's going to be problems, many of which even Gandalf the White can't solve. Textures will improperly render. Character models awkwardly collide with things they aren't supposed to be colliding with. Level design taking longer than previously thought because there just aren't enough rocks yet. A global goddamn pandemic that forces everyone to stay at home and type code while their cat walks across the keyboard. The game's jiggle physics just aren't titillating enough yet. All these issues and more can lead to delays in that previously thought to be airtight schedule, and thus when it comes time to launch the thing, there may still be months of work to complete with only a few short weeks left to actually do it, so the game can be printed to disk and then shipped around the world. All of this is tied to one key date in that initial planned schedule for human suffering, game development, the game's eventual release date. The day a game will finally release is often cause for needless celebration among the masses of game-loving individuals the world over, something that I am admittedly at fault for encouraging at times. But if the game isn't going to be ready by that point, there really are only two options present for the development team. The first one is to delay the game to a later date, or until the game is actually, ready to be played, thus giving the developers time to locate and fix problems in a timely, potentially cost-effective, and health-conscious manner. This is generally regarded as a bad move, for no other reason than it makes the thing come out later and is therefore bad, so studio higher-ups, or more accurately the ones who control the money, oftentimes take option 2, crunch. And so development teams crunch in order to get the game released, sometimes managing to somehow come through in the end and deliver a hopefully finished project, or just end up dealing with the studio heads delaying the game anyways, despite all the needless pain and suffering, but eventually a game will come out, whether it's finished or not. And what's more, none of the previous reasons I've listed are truly to blame for why video game crunch happens. They are certainly heavily contributing factors in this regard, but they wouldn't be factors attributed to this industry if not for the main cause of development strife. There are all manner of reasons for why this has become common practice, but there is one turning point in gaming history that led to this culture of overworking employees just to make sure the pixels on screen looked right early enough to excite kids on Christmas or to scare ill-informed individuals flavor blasted by information about Crash Bandicoot's alleged past criminal dealings. And what was the turning point, you ask? The release of Sonic the Hedgehog 2 for Sega Genesis. Yes, really. Sonic the Hedgehog first released for Sega Genesis in North America on June 23, 1991, with the game coming to Japan and the PAL regions the following month. Featuring the titular anthropomorphic hedgehog running through various levels, collecting jewelry and fighting Humpty Dumpty ever so grumpty, the game emphasized speed and choice over everything else, and for a while looked like it was the beginning of the rise for Sega here in the States. Then CEO Tom Kalinske, having been brought into the company only a year or so prior after leaving his previous gig as CEO of Matchbox, had been given the unenviable task of helping Sega rise above the juggernaut of gaming that was Nintendo, who only a few years earlier had revitalized the home gaming industry in the United States with the release of the Nintendo Entertainment System, and as such, held a stranglehold on the gaming market. But thanks to some clever marketing moves, Sega finally began gaining ground in the industry, leading up to the eventual release of what they hoped to be the Mario Killer. This all started when Tom Kalinske learned that Sega of Japan had held an internal contest of sorts to determine a winning design for what they hoped would become the mascot of Sega. Dubbed Mr. Needlemouse, the original design skewed much edgier than the more hip, cool guy persona of the character today, with vampire fangs, longer spikes, a backstory of him being part of a rock band, and a human girlfriend named Madonna, which, as we all know, Sega would never let Sonic kiss a human woman, right? Right? If you're at all familiar with the character, you'll know that most of this original concept is not indicative of his current design. Nowadays, he just likes to wear a scarf instead. A few employees at Sega of America rightfully disagreed with Sega of Japan's decisions on a few key points, and eventually the character became the iconic blue hedgehog we all know and tolerate at best to this day. When Sonic the Hedgehog was set to release, Tom and the gang at SOA made the bold decision to not sell the game. Instead, they switched out the pack-in title for the Sega Genesis at the time, Altered Beast, for Sonic the Hedgehog, and systems just began to fly off the shelves. Couple that with some other smart marketing moves that are better detailed in Blake J. Harris's book Console Wars, and you have one hell of a start for the Blue Blur. Cut to about a year later, when Sega was riding high after several more successful marketing and business moves and getting ready for the release of Sonic the Hedgehog 2, which was set to release in November of 1992. Wanting to somehow one-up the success of the first game by actually selling it for a change, and to try and make Sonic 2 the biggest game of all time, two of the marketing people at Sega of America, Al Nielsen and Madeline Schroeder, decided to go ahead with a crazy idea for a game release at the time. Release the game at the same time worldwide. Now, I know given the ubiquity of worldwide launches these days, that's not that much of a novel concept, but in 1992, it was a big deal. So much so that Sega basically had to revolutionize their distribution system just to achieve this goal of getting the game to stores day and date so they could achieve a further goal of the first ever worldwide simultaneous launch, because they wanted to one-up their previous game launch by actually having people buy the game. All things said and done, the launch went mostly without a hitch. Sonic the Hedgehog 2 would eventually become the second best-selling game on the Genesis behind the first Sonic the Hedgehog, and it did a lot of things to improve the gameplay of the first, including introducing the spin dash, improved the already stellar visuals, and brought in Tails, the immortal mutated fox boy. But a well-executed launch is not why Sonic 2 is to blame for game crunch. No. The marketing is. Sonic 2 released worldwide on November 24th, 1992, on a day that the marketing team at Sega of America dubbed Sonic Tuesday. This was unprecedented for two reasons. I already mentioned the first being that they had to completely change around their entire distribution network, but the other reason is simply that games did not release like this back then. They didn't really have concrete release dates. Okay, sure. They technically had a date they would release on, but because of conflicting distribution networks between stores and game makers, and then shipping the game potentially all the way across the country or even world, and a whole mountain of other factors to consider that have since been streamlined, there was never a guarantee that the game would arrive at your store on release date. Someone in California might get the game on the originally posted release date, but if you were in New York, it could potentially take a few extra days to get to your store, having to travel across country to get there. But that all began to change with the release of Sonic 2. In its first week of sales alone, Sonic 2 sold more than 400,000 copies, eventually reaching the total of 6 million just on the Sega Genesis. With the introduction of Tails into the mix, the game began exploring the world and characters that inhabited it, eventually giving us a wildly diverse cast, including the likes of Knuckles the Echidna, Rouge the Bat, Amy Rose, Big the Cat, Espio the Chameleon, Charmy Bee, Vector Crocodile, and so many deviant art personas. The game even helped to skyrocket Sega's market share in North America, bringing them up to about 40% of the total market within 6 months of the game's release, and finally within throwing distance of toppling the juggernaut Nintendo. But hearing about cuddly little characters with questionable sex appeal and good sales numbers isn't really why you clicked this video, now is it? The reason you're here, and the other thing that began to change with the release of Sonic 2, wasn't even directly related to the blue blur, but what the second game's release started. Or you clicked on this video because I'm blaming a fictional video game character for a truly problematic part of the largest entertainment medium on the planet, but I'm gonna go with that first reason just so I can, keep making a video. By releasing what is arguably one of the largest games at the time on a single release date across all retailers, a standard was set. Games should be releasing on the same day and as many places as they can. And throughout the rest of the 90s, that's exactly what ended up happening. It was a gradual change at first, with some releases sticking to old habits while others adapted immediately, but by the time the new millennium reared its ugly head and new systems like the PlayStation 2 and Microsoft Xbox were flying off the shelves while the GameCube looked on with a broken heart, games now released on specific days. Not necessarily worldwide, but the same day for certain countries and regions rather than spread across multiple days within a single country. As games grew bigger, cost more to make, and required larger teams to craft, they also required more time to develop and iterate. While some studios were fine with the expanded development cycle or adapted to working on multiple titles at a time to compensate, others slowly began to fall apart thanks to the prerequisite that they release on a specific, predetermined day years in advance. Now, it wouldn't be easy, and there would likely be those who oppose it, but I personally feel game development should shift away from concrete release dates to allow the developers more time to actually make these things without feeling the pressure. There could still be a release window or a time frame that you're aiming for since, it's got to come out at some point, but by widening the range of when it comes out, that could really help to create better products in the long run. Recent releases like Anthem, Cyberpunk 2077, and Fallout 76 are perfect examples of why we need this. Even with them all having delayed their release dates and promises of not crunching, the games released in poor, unfinished dates and had to utilize crunch to release earlier rather than even later. There are all manner of reasons for why these games release the way that they did that don't just fall to the release date, and you could even argue that there are several more problematic reasons why crunch happens in the first place. Maybe executives and studio higher-ups want to push the game out quickly to minimize development costs. It could be to help ease the minds of shareholders or fans. Maybe the game needs to release before a certain time to allow for studio-wide pay bonuses. It could even be just because the studio is so tired of working so long on the dang thing and want to either move on to the next project and just take a hit with this one, or so they can move on from the studio or even industry itself in some cases. Whatever the reason may be, this practice in gaming is still happening. And ultimately, this video was really just a silly way for me to blame Sonic the Hedgehog for video game crunch. Much of this video is speculation and educated guesses on my part, since I don't work within the industry itself, but it's a serious discussion that I feel needs to be addressed. There are certainly more qualified individuals to tackle the subject better than I could, but forcing development studios to overlook their employees for any reason is ludicrous to me. Whether it be to appease fans, earn bonuses, minimize development costs, or because Sega decided to do a worldwide launch back in 1992. All I ask is that the next time a major game comes out that you're excited for, just be mindful of the people who are actually making it. No one likes it when a game is delayed or having to overwork themselves for any reason. And we should all practice a little patience when these things occur, rather than send death threats to overly tired, overly worked, and most likely underpaid individuals who probably don't even really have a say in whether the game was delayed or not. On the other side of that though, if we're not going to remove the barrier of release days, the least we can do is maybe not announce a game 8 years in advance. The simple fact that games get announced as early as they do nowadays is part of what this whole crunch industry is based around. Building up hype for a game, forcing your workers to get it out within a reasonable amount of time so you don't upset fans, and then hoping that it isn't launched in a broken, buggy state when you do that. If nothing else, this discussion was just a way for me to kind of vent about crunch, and the next time you get into a discussion about crunch in the games industry with friends, coworkers, or some random homeless guy on the street, well, maybe you could share a laugh over the thought that it's all Sonic the Hedgehog's fault. Thanks for watching my silly video, and I will see you in the next one.